We're still in our materials, Real Estate Law for Paralegals, Chapter 8, talking about deeds. This is Part 2. We're going to learn about the requirements of a deed. So we looked at earlier, what is a deed? And we learned that it was the document that transfers title or an ownership interest in real property. We looked at the two parties to the deed, the grantor and the grantee. And we learned a couple of different types of deeds. So now we need to know what the requirements of a deed are. Now there are several. First, you have to have a written instrument. It's important to have the date of the conveyance. You need it signed by a competent grantor. Identify the grantee. Recital of consideration. Words of conveyance. A legal description of the real property. Witnessed. Acknowledged. Delivery and acceptance. So not all of them are required everywhere. So in Texas, you can get by with just these 7. Other states, you might need to have all of them. Other states, you might need to have less. But these will get you by in Texas. So written instrument, right? So this is pretty self-explanatory. You have to have a written document. So when we say instrument, we're not talking about instruments, right? We're talking about a written document. So when you hear the term instrument, because that's what is used in real estate, we're talking about a document. And it has to be written because you can't transfer ownership in land verbally. Imagine what kind of world we would live in if you could transfer ownership of property verbally. Everyone would be suing everybody because they'd say, "Oh, you sold me that land," right? That's why we put it in writing to make it legal, to make it official. So it has to be written document. So now the date of conveyance, right? So you don't have to have a date on a deed. If you have a deed that does not have a date on it, you're still going to be okay, right? It's still going to be valid. Um, there's some other way that you could probably figure out the date if you needed to. But it's always good to have the date. That way you don't have to try to guess or figure it out, right? It's pretty self-explanatory if you have the date on there. You know when the deed was drafted, right? So not necessarily needed, but definitely highly recommended to have the date. So it has to be signed by a competent grantor. So when we talk about competent, what we mean is if you are a person, right, an individual, that you are of legal age, so 18, right, that's the age of majority in the United States. You're considered an adult at 18. You are considered a child at 17 and a minor, right? So if you're a person, you have to be of legal age and of sound mind. So sound mind, you know what that means, right? That means you're not loony, you're not crazy. You can make your own decisions. You understand the consequences of your actions. You don't have to have people make decisions for you. So if you're not competent, if you're not of sound mind, we don't let you sell property because there's a risk, a very high risk of you getting taken advantage of because you're not of sound mind. Um, Same thing for legal age. We don't let, if you're minors, sell property because they might not make the best decisions. So you have to be legal age and sound mind to be a competent grantor if you're an individual. If we're talking about a business, right? So if we have a Bubblegum Shrimp Company that owns a property and they want to sell it, then they have to make sure that that company is in legal existence, right? So they have to check their corporate papers to make sure that they are a legal entity on file with the state. They filed all their right paperwork, so they've paid all their taxes. Um, that's what it means to be in legal existence if you're a business. And also proper authorization, right? It has to be someone who is authorized to sign a deed, right? So imagine if you're Walmart, uh, the person who has to sign a deed to sell property is going to be some vice president or CEO or CFO. Um, the janitor at your local Walmart can't sign a deed transferring ownership of the property from Walmart. They have to be authorized person. So that's what it means to be signed by a competent grantor. Next, you want to identify the grantee. If you don't identify the grantee, then how are you going to know who you sold the property to, right? You have to have the person's name that's going to be the new owner on the deed. Otherwise, you haven't sold it to anyone. Now, the grantee doesn't need to be competent, right? So they don't need to be of sound mind and of a legal age, right? They can be minors and they can be people who can't make their own decisions. We just don't let them sell and get rid of property. We'll let them receive property, though. So you just identify the grantee. So something important is, if you have shared ownership, right, which we talked about in chapter 2, if you have shared ownership, and even if you have individual ownership, you want to state the manner in which title will be held. So tenants in common, joint tenants with right of survivorship, husband and wife. All those things have designations have important consequences, as we learned in earlier on, right? Community property. If you say husband and wife, that means it's community property in Texas. You learn the ramifications of the joint tenants with right of survivorship, right? And then if you're unmarried, man or woman, you want to put that so that way it's not community property. So identify the grantee and the manner in which title will be held. Next, you need a recital of consideration. So this just means something of value has been exchanged, right? Mostly you'll see something that says for $10 and other valuable consideration. This is that's nominal. It's what you find in most deeds, unless it's some sort of special circumstance where there's a fiduciary capacity or something like that, might actually have the purchase price. Some states actually require the purchase price to be in deeds, but most of the time you're going to find this for $10 and other valuable consideration. That just means there's something of value that's been exchanged as between buyer and seller for the deed. Next, you want to have words of conveyance, right? So this is language in the document that expresses the present intent to convey the property. So these are the words that say, I want to transfer this property to someone else, right? It expresses the fact that they're transferring the property. And most of the time, these words are going to be grant, sell, and convey. And you'll see all three of them. They sound to me like they all are the same thing, but they still have all three in deeds. It's just sort of standard language, but that expresses the present intent to sell, right? Because you're going to grant ownership to someone. You're going to sell ownership to someone. You're going to convey ownership to someone. So you have to have words of conveyance. Next, you have to have a legal description of the property. And so I'm going to show you the two types of descriptions that are used mostly. So the first one is what they call a plat description. So this is where a developer has uh, developed a community and put in streets and lots. So we're going to look at a PDF here. So you'll see here is the legal description. It's called a plat description. Lot 43, Block 10, Walnut Cove, Section 1, subdivision in Montgomery County. So that is a plat section or plat description where it says lot, block, and section. The other type of description used is called a meets and bounds. So this one, the description begins down here, right? Being out of and a part of that certain 6.53 acres of land out of the W.J. Baker survey, right? But the real meets and bounds are right here. And so you have these measurements. South 71 degrees, west 111 feet. South 19 degrees, east along the west line, 150 feet, right? So those measurements are called meets and bounds. And if you follow this description, you'll get the shape of a property. So those are the two that are used in Texas is the plat description where you have a lot, block, and section, and then the meets and bounds description. All right. So the next one is called witnessed, right? So this is not required in Texas, but just like it says witness, right? Somebody witnesses the grantor sign the deed, and then they sign the deed, acknowledging that they witnessed the grantor sign. Then we have something called acknowledged. So this is not required for valid deed in Texas, but it is required for recording purposes in Texas. So what do I mean when I say not required for valid deed, right? So if we have our happy family who wants to buy a home and our folks who want to sell a home, they can exchange the money for the deed, and the deed does not have to be acknowledged, which means notarized, right, by a notary public. That deed is still good as between grantor and grantee, even though it's not acknowledged or notarized. The problem comes when we have third parties that start getting involved, you know, people who have liens, banks, and things like that. Then not having a deed that's acknowledged could become a problem. But as between grantee and grantor, it's not a problem. And then the last requirement is that it be delivered. And this means actual physical delivery of the grantor giving the deed to the grantee or someone who's designated to accept it on behalf of the grantee, right? So there has to be a physical transfer of the document that has been signed to the grantee. That's how you formally convey the ownership. And it also has to be accepted by the grantee. So I'm going to take a step back to the acknowledgement part. So we said it wasn't required to be valid, to have a valid deed in Texas, right? So you can have the grantee and the grantor don't have a notarized deed, but it's still valid between those two parties. But problems could arise when we get into third parties getting involved. And that's why we require acknowledgement for recording, um, is to help clear up some of those problems. So recording, when we talk about that, it's the filing of written instruments in the designated public registry. So each jurisdiction has a place to file real property records, right? So deeds and mortgages and liens and things like that. Every county um, or jurisdiction is going to have a designated place to file those records. In Texas, that's our county clerks that do that job. And in Harris County, um, here's the building. They're on the third floor of the civil courthouse, the county clerk, and you can take the documents down there to get them recorded. So we're going to talk about recording later on in chapter 11. We're going to go in depth, but you need to get familiar with the term recording early on so that way you know what we're talking about when we get there. So to record a document in the public records, it does have to be acknowledged or notarized, but it doesn't need to be acknowledged as to be valid between buyer and seller or grantor and grantee. So that will wrap up the requirements of a deed and chapter 8. So make sure you know which ones are required in Texas if you live here, and know what recording is.